My name is Arve Hansen, and on behalf of our research group, Russian Space Concepts, Practices, Representations, or RSCPR in short, I would like to welcome you all to this webinar. And the topic for today is Belarus. And the reason we're talking about Belarus now should be obvious to everyone present. The last few weeks have been quite dramatic, at least with the beginning of the nationwide protest that we saw all over Belarus from 9th of August, when people were disputing the official results of the latest presidential elections, where, of course, Alexander Lukashenka allegedly won the presidency for the 6th time. And the treatment of the post-election protests has been horrendous. There have been thousands of arrests, brutal beatings, lots of allegations of torture in detention centers, the one at Kristiina particularly. And we now see geopolitical powers taking an interest in the conflict. We have the EU and the United States. They have imposed sanctions on Belarus. And NATO is holding a special session today to discuss Belarus, among other things. And just yesterday, the Russian Prime Minister Mishustin visited Minsk for talks with Lukashenka. So Belarus is the center of attention. And I think now is a great time to discuss what is going on in the country and to try to understand the country, the Belarusian people, the country's political regime. And of course, we need to discuss what is going on, the context of it, who are the actors in these events, and then look at some of the possible outcomes of this crisis, not only in Belarus, but also how this might affect the stability in the region. So I'm very pleased to say that we have 3 experts on Belarus with us today, who will try to help us understand Belarus a little better. Our first panelist is Anders Rudling, who is a historian from the University of Lund. He's specialized on nationalism and identity in the East Slavic region. Our second panelist is Kristiina Silvan from the University of Helsinki, who is specialized in Belarusian and Russian affairs and the politicizing of the youth in particular. And our third panelist is Herasimenka, and he is a specialist on social movements and political communications in Belarus and Russia, and he's from the University of Westminster. So it's very nice to have you all with us, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts. So now, as an introduction, I will ask the 3 panelists to talk a little bit about their fields of expertise. And I think it is best to start with you, Per, because you've written about the history of Belarusian identity and nationalism, including 2 books on and several peer-reviewed articles. Could you say something about the historical foundation of Belarus or Belarusian identity, and how is this related to the current events? Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this invitation. I believe you have about 8 minutes or what, something like that?
Approximately.
Approximately, okay. Yeah. I haven't formalized my sort of comments exactly, but I've been working primarily on trying to answer the question, why is there a Belarus, which is always the question you get. You know, one question is why it's called Belarus or White Russia. The other one is why does this place exist? And that's sort of like been issues that have been at the center of my research. And I've been working primarily in order to understand contemporary Belarus. I think you have to look at the 20th century in particular. Belarusian nationalism, as it appeared, was a latecomer on the marketplace of nationalisms at the beginning of the previous century. As the eminent historian Valery Bulhakov in his book Belarusian Nationalism wrote, Belarusian nationalism is roughly 60 to 80 years behind the Ukrainian one. If the first Ukrainian newspaper, Zoria Halitska, appeared in 1848 in Halichina, in the Austrian Empire, the first Belarusian paper, Nasha Dolya and Nasha Niva, appeared only in 1906. If the Ukrainian language and grammar was codified in the 1850s, the Ukrainian, and I have the Belarusian grammar books, which I actually have in my bookshop behind me, I had to turn around to get them, Lyosik and Tarashkevich grammar books appeared around 1918, 1920. And if you look at the Bible translation, which is often sort of like a codification of the language, if the Bible was translated into Ukrainian in the final decades of the 20th century, of the 19th century, the Belarusian Bible, the entire Bible, appeared only in 1973. So if you look at these sort of like factors as building blocks of nationalism, Belarus was a relative latecomer. And the idea of Belarusian nationalism appeared in competition with other ideas. One was, of course, the idea of Zapadno-Russism, the idea that the Belarusians constitute one branch out of three in the sort of Russian family, along with the Great Russians, Little Russians. You have the Belarusians, right? That idea of a Ruski Mir, that they are part of one big family of peoples, of which they are one branch. Another one was the idea of Krayova, or Krayova ideology that appeared in the 1860s, stronger among Roman Catholic thinkers. The idea that the Belarusian territories were part of a community that can trace their roots back to the Respospolita, that the Belarusians, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, the sort of eastern part of the Respospolita, would have a sort of common legacy, not having been exposed to the Mongol rule for such a long time, a common history going back to the Magdeburg laws and Magdeburg rights and whatnot. The idea of Belarusian nationalism as a separate idea, the idea that the Belarusians should organize a state based upon their language, was, if you want, a plan C in this regard. It appeared rather late, during the time of World War I, when the Germans conquered the territory after the Battle of Tannenberg. They conquered the territory known as Oberost, that is Lithuania, southern Latvia, and a large chunk of Belarus, where they set up their administration. And here, Ludendorff, the commander of the German army, he wrote in his diary that we have, to our surprise, discovered a new people in the center of Europe. These were not Poles, these were not Germans, they were not Russians. They knew the Poles. The Poles were troublemakers all the way back to the partition of the Respospolita, and they certainly knew about the Poles from the Kulturkampf, and they didn't trust them. So in many ways, the Belarusians, since they were not Russians, could be sort of used instrumentally. So the Germans started from 1916 onwards, building school, reading huts, printing papers, theater groups and whatnot, to stimulate Belarusian national consciousness instrumentally as a counterweight to Polish nationalism. Of course, in 1918, when after the Brest-Litovsk negotiations broke down and the German army pushed forward eastwards, all of Belarus came up under German control. And on the 25th of March 1918, an unrecognized, self-proclaimed Belarusian People's Republic, Belaruskaya Narodna Respublika, was declared as a statement of Belarusian identity. It was never recognized, but it was a powerful statement of the intention of setting up a Belarusian state. They printed the postage marks, they had issued passports, they designed uniforms for the army and whatnot, without having an army, without having firm borders, without having a postal service and whatnot. But it was a powerful statement that appealed to the nationalist imagination. Imperial Germany collapsed, as you all know, in November 1918, and then came the Bolsheviks, then came the Poles. The Lithuanians were able to get control of the Vilnius area for a while, a very complex situation in which several parties here used the idea of nationalism instrumentally. The Poles under Piłsudski held his nose and declared support for the Belarusian national idea as he marched eastward. even though he said to his private advisors, I wouldn't discuss the idea of Belarusian autonomy without a revolver in my pocket. His commitment was limited. The Bolsheviks, likewise, now they're calling here, the Bolshevik likewise used this issue rather instrumentally. Stalin and Lenin, Stalin was the commissar of nationalities, and Lenin, who was in charge of the government, insisted when the Red Army was pushing further west that the Belarusians did exist as a people. The idea of Belarusian nationhood is real and should be taken seriously, fundamentally to address this issue that tore apart the empires of Europe, the Ottoman Empire, the Habsburg Empire, and of course the Russian Empire. That the idea of, as Terry Martin put it, of the great dangerous principle, the idea was that Russian chauvinism was stimulating Latvian, Finnish, Polish nationalism. If we address the idea of Russian oppression and meet the nationalists halfway, we can sort of like ride this tiger, including the Belarusian nationalism. And it set up in 1919 the first Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. No less than 6 Belarusian statehoods were proclaimed in 1918 and 1921. None of them became real states in our Max Weber's understanding of the word, but sort of proto-states. The idea that the Belarusians exist, the idea that the Belarusian language exists, the idea that the Belarusians should have the right to statehood, in theory, was generally agreed upon. And in the 1920s, a period of intense nationalization was pursued by the Bolsheviks to join policies of one called Karenizatsiya, of rooting Soviet rule in the local populations, and the idea of Belarusizatsiya, of building Belarusian institutions. The 1920s was a period of intense nation building in Soviet Belarus, and part of a larger sort of geopolitical struggle between Poland and the Soviet Union. Over the 1930s, of course, this policy came to backfire. The policy stimulated more nationalism than Stalin and the central government in Moscow was willing to accept. And of course, as all of us know, the 1930s led to repressions. About 90% of the Belarusian members of the Belarusian Union of Writers were repressed, and a lot of the achievements in terms of Belarusization was rolled back. But the policy of Karenizatsiya continued throughout the Soviet period. The number of ethnic Belarusians staffing the government increased and continued so all the way up to Khrushchev and Brezhnev's policies of Russification. There was also a Karenizatsiya, and a nation was slowly appearing. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, arguably there wasn't really a Belarusian nation in the sense of a political community of activists ready to build a society as such. Lukashenka was elected with over 80% of the votes in, I guess, arguably the only free and fair elections in 1994, on the platform of dissolving the state, or in one way or another integrating it or reintegrating it into the restored union. It has changed over the years, and Lukashenko, when met by somebody who outed him from the perspective of being in favor of a union, had to change the position. And from 2001 onwards, when Putin declared unexpectedly that if we really want a union with Russia, why not just dissolve the state and have it join oblast by oblast into the Russian Federation? That would be a true unification in the sense of the word. And of course, in that sense, he outed Yeltsin and Lukashenko as proponents of this union state. And from there on, Lukashenko increasingly started emphasizing sort of Belarusian state, Belarusian institutions, and distinctiveness from Russia. And this is something that he has increasingly tried to appropriate also the part of the history of the BNR, of that legacy that was the preserve of the opposition. I can talk about this in great detail. I'm not at 10 minutes. I'm looking at my phone, which keeps calling me here. But I leave it at that, because I think that is sort of like the background which I would like to give. Why is there a Belarus? How did this polity appear? Why is it contentious? Why was it part of a number of alternatives? And why has it developed differently than, say, its neighboring states, Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia? But maybe we can discuss this in the Q&A session.
I hope we will. Thank you for that interesting introduction to Belarusian history and identity. And for me, looking at this from the outside, it seems like the youngest generations of Belarusians are now more interested in their national past than the older Soviet generations, and it seems like they're sort of rejecting the official historical narrative a bit, or at least questioning it. And Kristiina, you are researching youth organizations in Belarus and Russia. And you've written extensively on the pro-Lukashenkian organization BRSM, or the Belarusian Republican Youth Union. And I remember during my studies at various universities in Minsk, this organization BRSM was omnipresent. They were everywhere organizing sporting events and social gatherings, and they were trying to, I would say, safeguard that official narrative, that official identity. And they were doing that quite successful too. But that has obviously changed. Could you please tell us a little bit about your work on youth organizations and the role of such organizations during the past weeks and months?
So thanks for that brief info. Indeed, I'm going to talk about Belarusian youth, but even more, I'm going to talk about BRSM, which is, as Arve rightly pointed out, that's been the sort of focus of my PhD dissertation, where I study pro-governmental youth activism in Russia and Belarus. And in these 8 minutes, I'll try to explain how it's possible that you had a seemingly huge and quite successful youth organization run by the government, and then suddenly you have hundreds and thousands of young people on the street. Here's just one slide about Belarusian state youth policy and the so-called BRSM or BRYU model. So what the BRYU is, it's a kind of present-day Komsomol in Belarus. It's even sometimes called the Lukamol, as Lukashenka's Komsomol. It has a sort of voluntary obligatory membership and officially 500,000 members. And what the BRYU does is, first of all, mobilizes young people to government organized events, especially during state holidays, but also during electoral campaigns. So it's BRYU activists that usually collect signatures for government affiliated candidates at all the elections in Belarus. And they also observe elections. And this is quite important. This is the kind of political function that the BRYU has. But what I've done in my PhD dissertation is I have conducted ethnographic work in and within the BRYU, and really sort of try to understand these social functions that the BRYU has in the life of young people. So when it comes to volunteering and all kinds of fun social events, I have been attending those in 2016 and 2017, also a little bit of in 2017. And what I found, you can find a more academic version of this argument in a recent article that was published in Demokratizatsiya, is that the membership, like an active membership, is stigmatized. Which is why young people employ different strategies of disengagement depending on what their role within the organization is. And I have found that engagement is, in a way, a ritual act. It is no marker of one's political stance from, the individual's perspective, and it certainly does not generate support for the regime. I will say a few bit more about that later. Here's just photos of, first of all, me attending one of the BRYU events, taking a fun picture. Obviously, the point of the event was not to listen to the lectures. It was an event about basically electoral activity, but to sort of just hang out with one's friend. You could skip class and you could take fun photos like this one. And on the other, in the other picture, you see the sort of information board of the BRYU committee in the historical faculty of the Belarusian State University. Perhaps I'll have more time to tell more about that later at the QAA. Now here comes the numbers. So I suppose nobody's surprised if I say young Belarusians have been politically apathetic up until very recently. There's a really valuable survey conducted by Zois in February 2019, and they did a follow-up survey in June 2020, where you can really see this change in political activity and political interest. So if in 2019 only 40% of young Belarusians were interested in politics, in June 2020 it was already up to 60%. This is something Alex will for sure talk more about in his presentation, but the fact that young people knew, so many young people knew about protest in 2019 where there weren't that many, tells us something about where young people access information, and that has been really important as well. And another thing that was nicely highlighted by the February 2019 study conducted by Zois is that there was this resentment among young Belarusians. Over half of them thought that things had got worse over the last decade, and there were expectations of the government in terms of economic reform. Not so much political alone, but it was either economic or political and economic. And also the trust in president was kind of 50-50. Now what happens in the in late spring 2020 is we see, first of all, the COVID denialism of Lukashenka and the grassroots activization. That's one thing. And then we see the three alternative presidential candidates emerge. And this really caused perhaps some hope and euphoria about a change that might be happening. So we see that in June 2020, 80% of those surveyed were planning to vote, and of them, you know, the vast majority was going to vote for alternative candidates. Lukashenka's sort of possible support was very low. So in summer, we see these massive Tikhanovskaya rallies and the euphoria and the fun. And at the same time, BRYU didn't actually hold any rallies. So the official big youth organization was pretty much silent. There were some small events, but no huge rallies like the opposition candidates. And here I come with my sort of argument of this really small, short introduction, is that in Belarus, there have appeared kind of two tiers of youth activism. And this is because of the structural problem of the BRYU as a mass membership organization. So of course, if membership is supposed to, if the organization is supposed to admit everyone, there is going to be different political views held by members, and membership is not in a way ideologically exclusive. There was a faulty assumption by the Belarusian authorities that ideological upbringing would take place within this field of BRYU as a kind of a process of political socialization. But if the number of really generally ideologically committed members is very low, of course, none of that is happening, and none of that did happen. So in my own research, I have found that there are different motivations to participate. Some of them are purely material, many are non-material. And in a way, this sort of pro-governmental youth activism, it operates in a different mindset or a different place than sort of government critical mass activism against the government. So as long as the second tier of, say, independent activism was not available, the BRYU was doing quite well. But once it appeared, it kind of came on top of this pro-governmental activism. And this you can see in this photo. I don't know if any of you saw this story on Tutbai, I think 2 weeks ago, where a local newspaper confronted this young lady with basically asking what on earth, why was she participating in a sort of anti-Lukashenka, one of these demonstrations, if just a month before she had been participating in a sort of government organized mobilization thing. And I think this highlights quite well and that a person can both participate in the sort of official youth activities and still also, demonstrate that, for example, they don't accept police violence or rigged elections. So I think I shall stop here. Perhaps we'll have some questions. I have already been talking for too long. So thank you for listening to me for this.
So there's interesting observations, and especially that young people are rejecting the BRSM. And I just a few days ago I saw on the Nehta Telegram channel that people were lining up on the 1st of September to announce their withdrawal from this organization. And that brings me into our third panelist, Herasimenka, who has been researching and writing a lot about political communications in Belarus and Russia, and especially the use of digital ways of organizing protests. And this is very relevant right now. Could you, Ales, please help us understand this aspect of protest organization in Belarus?
Yeah, thank you. Well, indeed, I've been studying protest movements in Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, mostly from the perspective of using digital media, and that's what we observed a lot these days as well, I believe, in Belarus. And it's I think a question about media, about the use of internet, is one of the questions that can contribute to help us to answer what's happening now in Belarus and why we see this level of and the scale of protest that we never seen before, in fact, in this country. Though obviously all the previous topics and observations also very much relevant to answering that particular question. So in my work, I've been looking at several past movements in Belarus, and one of the past movements happened 2017, and it was about a very weird policy of imposing a tax on unemployed people, so they had to pay for being unemployed. And this was something that produced large mobilization, and it was actually the first time in 20 years when mobilization spread beyond Minsk, beyond the capital, in a large scale. So I would say that moment was, I would say it was a predecessor, a first sign of something coming. And it came 3 years later in the form of the present protest movement. I would suggest it's pro-democracy protest movement that we're seeing every day now in Minsk and elsewhere across the country. And in terms of use of digital media, I think it's important to understand that Belarusian media system is very weird and quite unique for Europe, at least, with television and radio FM stations being monopolized by the state in terms of political news information. There is no critical information on television that produced in Belarus. When one FM radio station more or less independent, but still it's registered in Poland rather than Belarus. and so on. But something happened over last years, and what happened, I think, really resulted in a failure of Belarusian state, of Belarusian government, to get the situation right and correctly. So I think Belarusian authorities somehow missed that moment when it seems like huge numbers of people not just became interested in politics, as Christian suggested, at least youth people, but not just young people, but also they became interested in political information online, and specifically visual political information. And with YouTube, that is most popular social media in Belarus, as well as in many other countries, YouTube grew as an important source of political information for the first time over last years. And specifically, a number of bloggers, political bloggers, emerged on YouTube. And those bloggers became very instrumental to the mobilizing during the first stages of the movement, when we didn't see much protest, but we saw a lot of political discussion. Discussion was first about maybe economy, also about COVID crisis, and very weird response of the government to the COVID crisis, where lockdown wasn't imposed, and essentially the risk of COVID wasn't recognized by the president. Then it was a political campaign, presidential campaign, and one of the key candidates, as you might remember, was actually one of the most popular YouTube bloggers in Belarus. His surname is Tikhanovsky. He announced his candidacy, that he would be running in May 2020, and in 3 weeks he was arrested, detained, and now he's still in prison. But his wife decided to run, and now he's sort of a symbolic leader of the movement. And essentially his fame comes from YouTube, and her fame as well, because she'd been using his channels of communication to advertise her agenda, as well as also find supporters, followers. It's one factor. So I would say during spring and summer, people became very much interested in politics. Government missed this. They didn't get it. They didn't really develop any channels of communication through those most popular social media in Belarus. And immediately after the election day, and during the election day, and just before it, another communication channel became very important, and this is called Telegram. And this is a messaging platform that has been used in many predominantly Russian-speaking countries to discuss politics for several years now. But in Belarus, it wasn't that popular and that important as it's say in Russia. But over the last couple of months, it became extremely important for coordination and mobilization of and organizing the protest. And the key channel called Nechta, which means somebody, and Telegram functions a bit like YouTube. It also broadcasts. It also allows people to broadcast ideas without really much kind of feedback. And there are different ways to kind of organize discussion, but the most popular is called channel. That's where people broadcast anonymous ideas. So several channels emerged long ago. In fact, Nechta was essentially YouTube, investigative YouTube channel, very much like Navalny organization in Russia. And that person created a small team of sort of quasi-journalism team that started collecting information about this protest movement, emerging protest movement, and suddenly it became most important channel for coordination of protest. It's now based in Poland, but people in this team are from Belarus. They escaped for political reasons in the country, and it grew. This channel grew in numbers very fast over the last couple of weeks, from about 500,000 users to more than 2 million. 56% of those 2 million are from Belarus. They say so. So what we see is a number of communication channels that have been actively used by protest movement, and state couldn't do much about them. First couple of days after election day, during the most violent protest, state tried to block internet. As you might remember, many websites was blocked, but it doesn't mean that they could block Telegram easily. It was still available more or less, at least in terms of text messages. And moreover, this shutdown of internet didn't lasted for 61 hours, and then internet returned, and that's when people learned about the scale of violence, scale of repression that happened over those days when internet was off. But except for this kind of brutal try and crack down on the internet, and the government couldn't really propose any countermeasures to this very powerful, very fast-growing ecology of media, of protest media in Belarus. And still, after 4 weeks, we don't see much, except for attempts to look for help from Russia, from Russian actors, Russian channels, Russian media, but not much from Belarus government itself. We're very happy to discuss what might happen next.
Okay, thank you very much, Alias, for those observations. I remember the protest movement in Moldova in 2009. They called the Twitter revolution. Could you now talk about the a possible Telegram or YouTube revolution in Belarus, or what's your take on that?
Yeah. Well, it was quite fashionable, right, to call various protest movements that have been happening about 10 years ago as a Twitter revolution. Then in Egypt we had Facebook revolution, but obviously it's not about platforms. It's about people who use them and people who organize people through use of those platforms. Well, some people have been calling this this events or even revolution in Belarus Telegram revolution. I'm not sure it's the best way to call it this way. But what I think is, actually, we need to ask people how to call it. We don't have a name yet.
Yeah, true.
There was a survey that's been asking people how to call it. I think some people suggested calling it Flower Revolution or Women's Revolution, which is, I think, also a good name. But about Telegram, I think what happened is just it's appeared to be a very useful tool for very rapid coordination. As I managed, it's anonymous, so it protects you if you are trying to lead protest in a way. So we don't really know many local leaders who've been organizing people for last month through Telegram, not from Nechta, not through those popular large channels, but from essentially in every single location in Belarus, a channel or a chat, a group emerged that coordinates its action. So in every single location, when we see 10 people on the street every evening or every week, there's certainly a group on Telegram where they discuss their organization. And there is 1 or 2 or 3 people in that group, might not be standing on that moment when we see in the pictures people protesting, maybe sitting somewhere, maybe not even in the country, who've been happy to organize them. And those people, I believe, are key coordinators, and we might even call them leaders. So government in Belarus has been trying to find who are the leaders, try to understand. They've been arresting so many people, detaining so many innocent people who've been active politically or even not, including academics. But they couldn't find who is the coordinator, because coordinator, they spread anonymously across the country, and it's very, very difficult to understand their identity. So that's the power of Telegram.
Yeah, well, that's kind of typical for a Belarusian way of suppressing discontent. As soon as someone sticks out their head from the crowd, it's that they're neutralized. We have 3 topics for today's discussion. I would like to discuss the context of whatever is going on briefly. I would like to discuss the responses to the elections and to the events, and I would like to be able to discuss different scenarios and how might this develop. But what are the main reasons for the discontent in Belarus right now?
Perhaps I will start with an anecdote.
Please do.
From my fieldwork, one of the people I interviewed in BRSM, who is an employee of BRSM, and I was talking to him like, so how do you see the future? Like, is Belarus going to the right direction or not? And even he sort of thought for a bit, and then he said, we need economic reform. So I think that is perhaps the sort of maybe long-term reason that I would point out in the very beginning is that there's a growing sense that Belarusian economy is if not failing, then at least not doing as well as it should, and a growing sense that Lukashenka is not managing with the economy. We know that Lukashenka's idea of how to basically have economic growth is just to work more in the field and sort of, just do it. And I think there's a growing sense among the population that this just doesn't work anymore. And that kind of brings me to the other point of Lukashenka being sort of as an attractive leader to a smaller and smaller group of people, especially after this COVID crisis, where he blatantly refused to take any action. He was blaming people for getting sick. So in a country that claims to be socialist and take care of its citizens, I think that sort of caused resentment among those people that perhaps Lukashenka could consider his core electorate.
My impression of this is that the protests are rather wide and have been triggered by the blatant manipulations of the elections, and with the arrest and the disproportionate violence by the authorities, the in many cases allegations of torture circulating on social media triggered an outrage and anger with the authorities. This of course took place in 2010 in the previous election also, but here now I think as Alice pointed out, something has been brewing over the past few years, and there's also a slow generational change, sort of like the Soviet references, the identification with the BSSR flag and the sort of the Kapusta coat of arms and whatnot, references that would resonate with people that were raised the late Soviet generations, that grew up in Soviet Belarus and remember positively the stability of the Brezhnev era. These references no longer make much sense to people grown up in an entirely different era. So I think what's striking here is that how wide the protests are and how relatively the relative absence of ideology in this. This is a protest against a government, and very similar to the protest of the Velvet Revolution in 1989, or the protest in Poland in 1980. There are such, when you look at history, of course, the moment when Lukashenko stands there at a tractor factory and they are screaming, "Ukhadi, go away," right? Of course, resonates with those of us who grew up with the protest of 1989 as a reference point. But if you compare to Ukraine, where you had the Maidan protest, you had a very broad segment of protesters, but they were disproportionate from Western Ukraine, and you saw there among the protests, you saw EU flags and also the black and red UN banner of the far right. If you look here at the Belarusian protests, you don't see many EU banners. You see the sort of the old state flag, the white, red, white flag, as a sort of unifying factor of the emergence of a civic society. You don't see ideological banners. You see sort of a mobilization, the emergence of a modern civil society. And if I were to cite, since I have Kristiina here, Johan Wilhelm Snellman, the founder of the Finnish nationalism, he said in an unguarded moment in 1861 that there wasn't a Finnish nation in 1809, but now there is one, he said in the 1860s. He was, of course, forced to retract this. But this sort of statement, I think, could somewhat delay the plight to Belarus also. When I went to Belarus in 1990 saying I'm interested in studying Belarusian history, I often get the message, well, what do you mean? There is no such thing as Belarusian history. We don't have any history here, right? And often you can see among Sovietologists saying, well, Belarus is entirely a construct of the Soviet society and Soviet nationalities politics. Yes, it is to some extent, but now also this sort of flag, the white, red, white flag of a small group of activists composed in 1915, now takes on a different meaning. It's becoming the symbols of an emerging civic society. So it's the broad protests. And I think if we're looking at ideology here, I think we are somewhat mistaken. This is sort of like a society coming of age in a way, and it has to do with generational change. And of course, you can probably find economic reasons for this also. It's not as acute as in the case of protests against Yanukovych and whatnot. But here, of course, society which has been living relatively well off buying oil and gas at reduced prices, re-exporting them, and being able, if you're going to give Lukashenko some credit, and I think perhaps some is due here, it has been that he has been able to redistribute some wealth. And if you are 50 plus living on the countryside and away from the big cities, I don't see you would have an immediate interest in economic reform and looking at what happened in Eastern Europe with the shock therapy and whatnot. I think it's increasingly people being fed up with one government being in charge for a quarter of a century and being increasingly detached from the realities of population.
So you do believe that the white, red, and white flag is mainly a symbol of opposition, or is it also do people think about their national past, and is this a nationalist protest movement in a sense?
It would be a symbol of a nationalizing civic moment. I mean, one of the questions I get here now when I'm on these mailing lists, since I was in Singapore for the past 5 years, and they called me from South China Morning Herald, and the question they asked me is, so like, Putin says this flag is a symbol of fascism. Is there any comparison to the UN black and red flag? And of course, you have to make a distinction. These are very, very different flags. So this is one that appeared originally as sort of like a 19th century romantic nationalist symbol of the idea that there is a Belarus and we should have a right to form our own destiny. But it's not an ethnic nationalist flag in that sense. And it has taken on a number of meanings. When it appeared in 1915, it had a very different meaning than it would in 1944 when Ostrowski's collaborationist, indeed fascist group, used it for national mobilization. And of course, by Soviet propaganda, it was presented as a symbol of, therefore, by extension, a fascist movement. Then, of course, it became the symbol of Belarus at a time when Belarus was democratic, 1991 to 1995. And so I wouldn't call it a nationalist symbol as such. It's a symbol, sort of like it's a framework for society that rejects the sort of neo-Soviet symbolism and the government that uses these symbols. So it's a broad symbol of an emerging civic society, I would say.
You also said that you believe the protests, at least the protests now, are motivated mainly by the violence that we saw in the days after the election or on the election day. Could you elaborate on that, or do you think most people were not ready to protest on the 9th of August against the election, the widespread fraud?
I think this is a question for Ales or Kristiina, but certainly there is this moment that it's easy to mobilize against the government, which is increasingly seen as having lost authority. Not only that this election was so manifestly manipulated. I believe it was in 2010, Lukashenko in front of TV camera said, well, you know, they wanted to that I would win this election with what was it, 86%, but I settled for 78, or settled for 81. He sort of openly admitted manipulating this election. So of course the repression was disproportionate, and when this is done again and again and again, it seemed to be now in the making that some sort of enough is enough moment appeared. And what's striking, the way I see it, is that there isn't that much ideology. I mean, if you can gather these enormous protests, these are the largest protests in the history of Belarus. I mean, there was rather notable in 1990 when the People's Front were able to unite such large number of people, despite having a platform which wasn't necessarily in tune, I would say. Of course, it's notoriously difficult to measure popular preferences, but I think one problem is that the opposition, with certain symbolic issues, they had on the white, red, white flag, and issues like occupation, the Soviet regime was illegitimate, Stalin, and repression, right? And I would say the sort of platform that Semyon Pasniak pushed in the early 1990s resonated perhaps with an educated urban segment of perhaps 15 to 20%, but to a large sections of society, it didn't resonate, right? What's striking here now is now when the protests are using the same sort of symbols, it's relatively free of this sort of nationalizing confrontational rhetoric that the good Belarusian should speak the mova, should speak the language, right? It's now an inclusive protest of something else, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, these are very exciting things, and I want to talk more about this. And Alex, I'm also looking forward to his comments. But when it comes to this electoral fraud, I mean, I agree with Per. I think Belarusians always knew that the elections were rigged. So that's not the question, or that wasn't, you know, the surprise. But I suppose it was for the first time for some people who knew that they voted for an alternative candidate or wanted to vote for an alternative candidate, and they just couldn't believe the official figures. So I thought that sort of sparked the sort of rage that perhaps hasn't been there before. And when it comes to the blatant, you know, violence, I'm now actually thinking that perhaps in a way, Lukashenka's official ideology of Belarusian identity has been quite successful, because as some of you know, I mean, this is the kind of mantra that Belarusians are peaceful people, right? Belarusians don't, you know, do what the Russians do, or certainly don't do what the Ukrainians do. So if there is this notion, which I mean, I have anecdotal evidence from talking to people in Belarus, is that people really do see themselves as, you know, peaceful, as orderly. And then, you know, when you contrast that to the horrific violence that was, you know, exercised by the police, it's really, you know, that's the question of legitimacy and sort of stuff like that. And also, you know, talking to now like more opposition youth activists in 2016 and 17, I was kind of told, like, yes, if you get involved in opposition activities, first you're kind of threatened, then perhaps you're threatened some more, and then you can choose whether you leave the country or whether you're, you know, ready to face the consequences and go to jail. So perhaps this sort of fear, so there's this idea that just put you, you know, to jail and torture you out of just, you know, asking for, you know, just demonstrating that you're outraged by the blatant violence. I mean, that's really, you know, has been, I think, a surprise for a lot of Belarusians.
Yeah. Well, the discussion is very interesting, and I would obviously like to hear more whether from others' perspective, whether we really see any sort of new nation forming process, or it's something else. But discussion of flag and symbols, not just flag, but for instance, interestingly, when people get together, what they're gonna do on the street, they sing songs, right? But what songs in Russian and Belarusian? What songs they know all? Not many apparently, but they know some, and apparently leading most interesting songs very often in Belarusian language, which is not spoken by the movement, but symbolically used still. But regarding the causes, I would just highlight, perhaps I already mentioned, I think there was two contextual things that have been happening on the background, which is COVID response and also economy, and then there was a political opportunity opening. It's from perspective of people, from political perspective of activists. Political opportunity opening during election time, once in 5 years. It's always an opportunity for political discussion in the Belarus election. And then the regime didn't get change the situation right. Vitaly Silitsky, eminent Belarusian political scientist, called a Belarusian authoritarian regime a preventive authoritarianism, because it tries to preempt the possible threat by isolating any people who might pose this threat. So mostly they were political leaders who've been isolated before any possible emerging protest previously, right? Over many years, people have been killed, people had to leave the country, people were put in jail for many years. This happened now again. Political leaders, prominent party leaders, been isolated, but this time, maybe first time, it didn't work. And why did it work? First of all, interestingly, there was this factor of women politicians who somehow not repressed as actively as male politicians in Belarus. This very weird sexism of Belarusian regime perhaps played in hand of the opposition. And the second factor is, of course, as I mentioned, this an opportunity for new local leaders not to really reveal their names, but still remain very important and very prominent in coordinating political action. And regime couldn't really preempt anything in relation to them. They could not preemptively isolate them because they didn't know who they were, and they're still struggling to do this. So those three things, I think, influenced current protest.
It's interesting that you're mentioning music, because I remember from our research on the Maidan and the Euromaidan in Kyiv in 2013 to 2014, music was very prominent, and it was a way to create unity in a leaderless crowd and shape goals and give voice to discontent, even though the protesters were very different from each other, coming from all over the country and so on. So it's quite effective tool to create unity. So if anyone of you would like to comment on the Belarusian protesters' culture, and has a culture emerged, and how important is this to the protesters and the protest movement?
May I just start perhaps that Belarusian, I think Belarus has a long tradition of protest, and music been always part of it as well, like in Ukraine. But as now we see very broad movement indeed, with very, very different people joined it. Some of them indeed maybe like part of BRSM, some of them pro-Russian, some of them pro-European, some of them old, some of them young, and so on. It's very hard really to find common symbols, and even that flag is something amazing. I think during the first days, when the very first large protests erupted, I think many people were puzzled, where are those flags all coming from? So suddenly crowds started going on with those white, red, white flags. Factory workers, people in small towns, really, no one expected that anyone would try to hide somewhere in those places, in those categories of people would try to hide somewhere in far, far away part of their flat, white, red, white flag, a symbol for which you could be detained, could be beaten by police any moment over the last 20 years in Belarus. This is something amazing. Even those symbols is already something that they've been preserved over years, and they've been used now. This is indeed a miracle in a way.
Can I just say that I've been actually wondering this very same thing, because when I was there a couple of years ago, it was still a kind of, a negative somehow symbol. And I mean, I wasn't only talking to BRSM people, I was talking to some other. And I remember once someone kind of showed me like how do you call it, like a pin that you put on your clothes, and he was kind of like, do you know what this means? It's like what, white, red, white. And I was like, oh, where have you been? This is kind of crazy. So I've been also wondering, like, where do all these flags come from? And how is it possible that it has become such a positive symbol? I mean, it has gained sort of completely new symbolic meaning, I feel, in the last couple of weeks.
It's a good flag in the sense that it's very easy to make. If you want to make a successful flag, the one with embroidery you have right now, even though the hammer and sickle is gone, is probably the hardest one to reproduce in all of Europe, I would imagine. It's very complex, right? So this one is, if you have a piece of cloth back home and something red, you can make it yourself. And I think in that sense, it's a successful flag in that sense. It's simple, easy to make. And it has changed the meaning. I mean, when this becomes a symbol, I think it also reflects a sort of the rather broad umbrella nature of this movement. It was exactly what what Kristiina said, right? A symbol of a rather narrow linguistic nationalism that appealed to an elite. And I think to many Belarusians actually was perceived as exclusive. It was the symbol of the Pasniak and this particular interpretation of history. But it has changed the meaning. And I think part of this is also due to the fact that the Lukashenko government has increasingly, little by little, not formally, rehabilitated these symbols. They were presented, when the flag was abandoned in 1995, it was hoisted from the parliament building, ritually disgraced and tore up on TV and sold for, I believe, $10 a piece on a sort of an auction on television. So they went about this in a very sort of disgraceful, very sort of insulting way, as now we're heralding the beginning of something new. But little by little, as Putin started announcing that he was willing to contemplating absorbing Belarus into the Russian Federation, Lukashenko increasingly started little by little to appropriate the history also of the opposition. In 2018, there was a big exhibition at the Historical Museum in Minsk for the centennial of the Belarusian People's Republic. The BNR legacy, which only a few years earlier had been denounced as fascist, the flag as fascist. And I think this started already in 2008 when Sovietskaya Belarusia, or SB Sevodnya, had a roundtable discussion on the 90th anniversary of the BNR. That was the first sort of like sign that little by little the authorities were starting to rehabilitate this legacy. And 2018, this was a big exhibit about this. So it's been filled with a different meaning, and in those protests, the pahonia, or the chase, is sort of like the vitos, they call it in Lithuania, is a symbol of a regional identity, which is not ethnically exclusive. This was a symbol used by the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The flag was also has a federalist aspect to it. It was symbols that could be also indicating an openness also westward towards, of course, it's the Polish colors, is a tricolor that sounds like the Lithuanian flag, it has a Lithuanian coat of arms. So it is a pan-ideological, something pan-ethnic flag also in that sense. It doesn't exclude anyone. It doesn't exclude you because you don't speak Belarusian, as most people every day on everyday streets of Minsk do not. So it's we're seeing something else. Then, of course, we don't know we're still in this phase of euphoria of protests, and we don't really know where this is going to end and what's going to come out of this. And as an historian, I'm going to use the prerogative of not trying to make predictions. But of course, it's a little bit similar to situation 1989, and the people that gathered under the banners of Solidarność and whatnot, they developed a number of different directions, right? Right now they're mobilized against the regime, which seemed to have increasingly losing its credibility in the eyes of the public sphere. But of course, just like the people that protested in 1989 when the regimes came down all across Eastern Europe, one moved in the direction of charismatic Roman Catholic populists like Lech Wałęsa. Others went into the sort of like a populist nationalism like Orban. You had some going into hard right ethnic nationalism like Franjo Tuđman in Croatia, or others in the right direction of outright fascism like Vojislav Šešelj in Serbia, or for that matter, Žirinovski and whatnot, right? Right now they're protesting something, but we don't really see how this is going to crystallize. But it is noticeable that there are no party symbols in that sense. It's not organized parties. And you don't see many EU flags there, and you don't see many anti-Russian statesmen, the sort of stuff that would be an Ostankin or Первый канал. If something like this has been done, it's going to be exploited. So it's not anti-Russian. It is harking back upon the symbols of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and upon rather peaceful protests.
Are we seeing a new 1989, a new wave of protests in Eastern Europe? We saw the Ukrainian revolution 6 years ago, and now there are widespread protests in Belarus.
Really, I think it's really kind of an event that is very exclusive, quite exclusive to Belarus, I feel like. But things always can spread somewhere, but actually there is no any there is a discussion, say, in social movement literature whether any protest can spread anywhere, and it's something not clear. But what is clear is definitely Putin and the current authorities in Russia, they're afraid of any similar movement emerging, and they obviously, it might be one of the reasons why they kind of suppressing or potentially help to suppress or express the willingness to suppress this movement in Belarus. I think in Russia, especially during the first couple of days, many people have been watching the events in Belarus with very, very huge attention, and they've been covering the coverage of the events were quite positive. In fact, very in terms of support of the movement, even across state-owned or state-controlled media in Russia. Things changed over time, but before that, I think in the first week was very sort of supportive week, and I think Belarus became one of the key topics in Russian media. So clearly, definitely, the Russian government doesn't want to see this type of sort of pro-democracy narratives spreading across this country. And since Belarus movement, as I mentioned, is Russian-speaking, it's very clear what's happening there. You can't really hide details through, I don't know, interpreting, translating wrongly as it's been happening, or kind of interpreting events like it's been happening in Ukraine on Russian TV. Just it's very easy for Russian people to listen, to watch what's happening in Belarus, and partly it explains why more than 500,000 people subscribed from Nekta, those people who live in Russia, huge audience following events in Belarus, I think. So yeah, it's something that's been watched in Russia closely.
If I may just continue on that, I totally agree that it's been watched in Russia. I think it's both sort of inspiring and sort of horrible if you look at it from the Kremlin perspective. And I think both, well, Alex knows more about this than I, so perhaps he can continue, but perhaps both Putin and his associates and then Russian opposition are sort of taking a lot of notes on what has worked and what has not worked, and how to not make it work in Russia when there's going to be now these elections, local elections coming up in some of Russia's regions as well. And then maybe if I may sort of engage Pierre on this historical point. So of course, 89 and the Velvet Revolutions, it's all very positive, but I've been kind of wondering whether there could be a sort of Poland 1980 moment here, when there's euphoria and everything is going great. And that's when there's martial law. And then we have to wait for another 10 years or a bit less for anything to change. So I was actually wanting to ask Per whether he sees perhaps any of this 1980 possibility or scenario in Belarus right now.
Yeah, I think historians should stay away from making predictions about the future. I was wrong about Trump. I was wrong about Brexit. Even though I thought there was a slight chance that Le Pen might win the presidency in France, I was wrong on that one too. So I've been reluctant to make any predictions. But it seems to be the case that the keys to this development, to a very large extent, lies in Moscow and how Russia reacts. And I think in that sense, I think the protesters are aware of that also. If there would be an emergence of more radical groups, some Pravi sector figures and burning tires, and the idea here that the situation is spinning out of control. I think the protesters are quite aware that this is being instrumentalized for those who seek a pretext to crack down upon this, be it the current government in Minsk or the government in Moscow. But given how quickly, I mean, if we look at the situation in Ukraine, which was different in 2014, but how quickly that went. Once Yanukovych was gone, it was a matter of hours until the command on Crimea switched the nationality insignia and switched allegiance from Ukraine to Russia. Not many people died in this sort of peaceful takeover by the little green men of Crimea. And I would imagine that if this escalates into violent confrontation, I would imagine it could go very quickly in Belarus too. I would imagine if Russia had such strong influence on and over the military on Crimea in Ukraine, which had a much more antagonistic relationship to Russia than Belarus today, I think it could go. It might not even have to be a very violent transformation, but I could also see that either there's a change of guards internally within the government in Minsk, or some sort of 1981 Stan Voyenny Yaroselsky-like situation to appear. But everything is possible, of course, but it's notoriously difficult to say. I mean, we have relatively little information about what discussions actually now take place as we speak, both in Lukashenko's inner circle and, of course, in Moscow, or between Moscow and Minsk. This is very hard for those of us who don't have the intelligence information, but follow Telegram to come up with any sort of like credible long-term analysis of this.
Lukashenko has, well, one thing is that the protesters are speaking mainly Russian, and it should be very obvious that that there's lots of police brutality and should gain some kind of sympathy in the Russian population. But then we see the Levada Center recently made a polling of Russians stating that 39%, I believe, of Russians thought it was a fair election. And then we have Lukashenko painting this picture of Western powers on the borders, ready to invade not only Belarus, but also the Russian Federation, making sort of comparisons to the Soviet Union in 1941, before the Nazi invasion. Will Lukashenko be successful in selling this story, not only in Belarus, but in Russia as well?
I would say, like, Lukashenko has probably lost, I don't think he's been seen as a trustworthy, fully trustworthy person in Russia for some years already. So I don't think that Russia will, or Moscow will take what he says at face value, especially after this Wagner case as well. But I think that, of course, seen from the Kremlin, it might make sense that protesters are not waving EU flags, but they might still have some aspirations about closer relations to the West and sort of slowly trying to leave Russia's orbit. I wouldn't be surprised if that is seen as one of the problems for why Moscow cannot just, support the protest movement.
It's rather noticeable on Первый канал, which I watch on ITV, how relatively nuanced the Russian reporting is. I shouldn't use the word objective, but given a general tone there, which is quite one-sided and quite antagonistic towards the West in many regards, the reporting on Belarus is relatively nuanced, I would say. But of course, it's notoriously difficult to measure political sentiment in an authoritarian state. And it's of course hard to assess Lukashenko's support, but sometimes it is in the Swedish media, the reporting here, which is not always, I'm sad to say, that well informed. It's very often this undertone that Lukashenko has lost all credibility. He's supported by marginals, and he has support by, I think if we're going to give Lukashenko some credit, and if we're going to try to understand the nature of his governance, is that he has been able for quite some time at tapping into popular sentiment, and just like as Putin has been able to do that. Concern about the shock therapy was an issue in the early 2000s, in the 1990s. people on the countryside, on the kolkhozes and the government affiliated economy, were not really eager to go through this sort of stuff that Lithuania went through in the 1990s and 2000. Perhaps the references now have changed, that this has receded back into the what probably seems as a relatively distant past for a 22-year-old protester. But Lukashenko, I think, is also a product of his generation, and he is now 66 years old, right, if I'm not mistaken, which is soon approaching the time where you meet the average life expectancy for males in Belarus and Russia is around 70, 72, and there's a new generation simply taken over, and the references and the narrative that he was able to provide, the Soviet narrative, the fear of the West and whatnot, I think it resonates with a certain population, those depending on media and whatnot, not following social media and Telegram and whatnot. But I think it's decreasing in support, and I think as long as the economy sort of like was sensed in your wallet, if you look at Ukraine and the average Ukrainian makes about 1/3 the income what the Belarusian make. If the average income is $170 US in Ukraine and it's 300 in Russia, then of course this makes a difference. As long as you can feel that there is a yield, the government provides stability, but there is generational shift, and even a government, I don't say this is a very keen government, but even a talented government that feels out people's sentiments, after 26 years in power, particularly in authoritarian governments, you're all but bound to lose contact with the population. And it seemed for this meeting at a tractor factory in Minsk, I don't want to compare it to Ceausescu in 1989, but it seemed like Lukashenko was out of his element at that moment.
I think we need to give the audience the opportunity to provide their questions.
Hi, thanks for very three interesting inputs and a very interesting discussion. I'm David Miel-Wikström. I'm a professor of pop music history at the Pop Academy in Baden-Württemberg, and I'm also a member of the research network, which Andrei, Arve, and Yngvar, is also part of, and also one of the authors of Arve's mentioned book earlier. I would like to go back to what you said, Kristiina, about what you talked about earlier about the youth movement, and just go back a little bit from the protest, because for me and also for our hopefully upcoming research project, music has played a role, especially in Belarus. And what role music plays within the BRSM. I remember from Russia that the Nashi or Putin youth in the 2000s organized big concerts during the youth camps with big name Russian acts in the 2000s, especially after Surkov had a meeting with Kirechikov and other musicians. And could you maybe, and I also remember being in Minsk a couple of years ago and was at a concert which was hosted by Herasimenka with both VR and more underground bands. I was wondering if you could just talk about what role does music play within the youth movement. We were in the question of what role does music play in the protests. Alice, you mentioned that briefly with Russian and Ukrainian, and Kino song Peremen has been the one that's, especially in the outside of Belarus, has been promoted as the big protest anthem. Yeah, which music, who plays, and has it played any role, or has the BRSM and music, obviously BRSM not played any role, or what role has music played in the protests now too?
Thanks for the question. I'll start and probably Alice can continue. Yeah, the music question is a really good one. BRSM used to have these sort of Nashi style concerts, but it hasn't really been doing them, at least like when I was there doing my field work. That wasn't really a thing. They would play, for example, I was at this one meeting of the university BRSM group, and they started with playing from a loudspeaker the sort of new BRSM song of the university, and it really didn't like fly very well. So it was only the handful of activists who are like in the central like organ of the university BRSM organization that kind of knew it, and they kind of tried to sing along, but it was yeah, no, it didn't really fly. When there were sort of discos at these youth camps for BRSM, it was mostly Western pop music. So there isn't this sort of pro-governmental youth culture music scene. So, and this is also what we've seen, well, in the sort of earlier youth protest 2006, 2010, also now. So all the cool bands go with the go with the protesters. I think there was an attempt just before the election to sort of organize this big, to get these big Russian and also Belarusian names to sort of voice that they support. They support the Lukashenka's presidency or something, but it didn't. Then most of them just like didn't come in the end. Max Kors, who is like one of the popular artists, he said something like, you know, there shouldn't be violence and let's have stability instead. But that was like the best support that the government could get from these popular musicians. Maybe Ales has something that he can add, but that's kind of my knowledge.
Yeah. Very briefly, perhaps, for the context, in Belarus, there are popular musicians who cannot play or couldn't play public concerts until very recently because they've been openly supporting pro-democracy movements in Belarus. And it's been happening since like last 15 years. So it's a long process. And many popular, specifically Belarusian-speaking musicians, rock musicians, rap musicians, they couldn't continue their careers or just were living essentially underground life because they could not perform publicly. This changed over the last couple of years. Then during this movement, actually during the previous movements, those musicians, rock musicians, rap, they've been important sort of in channeling moods and indeed uniting people during the street action as well. 2006, for instance, 2004. This time, some of them again joined the protests, and as the protests were very decentralized, at some moments, some musicians been just traveling across the country supporting striking workers, medical workers, playing with the guitar. Then, of course, but what was the response of the government in terms of music, in terms of sound? Sometime when people gather on the streets, on the main squares, government brings very powerful sound equipment and starts broadcasting music to kind of silence down the discussion on the squares.
And it's because Soviet era music, right?
Sorry?
It's like Soviet era music,
yeah,
right?
And more interestingly, this is Soviet era music. It's even not even Soviet. It's sort of kind of Second World War music. This shows the level of creativity and the luggage or the sort of the pool or cultural pool from which the regime can sort of look for inspiration. Not much inspiration remained, definitely. Nothing to get inspired from present time, because clearly there was kind of a new cultural boom of protest song over the last couple of months in Belarus. Many cool musicians, both in Russian and Belarusian, started writing songs, and also in English. Previously, they've been pro-government, playing for Lukashenka, and now they play for this movement.
And if I might say something where I'm certainly out of my element here, but I participated about 10 years ago at the Letная Szkoła Belarusistiki in Hajnówka in Poland. And there I attended the concert in Baszowice in Podlachia, which was sort of like an outdoor concert, primarily, well, I believe, supported by various Polish agents here. But I was 36. I'm old now, but I was 36 then, and I was certainly out of my element because most of the people coming there were in the early 20s. The music was very loud, and it was sort of this sort of like festival sentiment there, right? Which wasn't really my cup of tea. But I have to say though, even though it wasn't my sense of music, my preferred venue, a very dynamic environment. They gathered in the forest, and they were Belarusian singers singing mostly Belarusian songs, and people sang along in some of them, but I didn't. Again, it's not my field, didn't recognize hardly any of them, but they were all in Belarusian, which of course might suggest that they they might be limited to the larger sentiment in Belarus proper. And there's of course this idea. I mean, she passed away very, very tragically and prematurely. Maria Paula Survila, the daughter of the president of the BNR Rada in exile, who was an excellent scholar in her own right of music, Maria Paula Survila, and she wrote this book of mermaids and rock singers in the early 1990s. And I knew her personally, a very, very nice woman. But her study then from 1993 was still at that point still in the beginning of Belarusian sort of civic society. And one thing I remember there was that she pointed out that many of the songs were what is saying in the Belarusian diaspora. The songs they had in Belarusian, didn't penetrate society very far. And it seems to be a change in that regard now, that suddenly, because even in Bashovich, I mean, when they were gathering these people in some people from diaspora, some people from Patriarchia, when they gather around the campfire, if Lukashenko can offer World War II era songs, actually, unfortunately, the situation was similarly the case with the opposition also. They were gathering to sing Voyatsky March, the sort of the songs, the anthem of the BNR and whatnot. They did not have a treasure of songs in the sense I remember from the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada, which had a wealth of songs. But it seems to be creating now a more modern folklore. And this is happening very, very rapidly. And I think it has to be sort of like, sanctified by this sort of protest movement, which gives it a meaning and context. Maybe that was what was missing for a long time. And we are seeing this one now materializing.
Can I just add one more thing about actually World War II? Well, not really about that, but about songs. Because when I was attending these BRSM or like BRSM summer camps, and there were these evening bonfires, it was exactly the Second World War era songs that were being sung. Like this was after the disco with all the pop and rock.
Okay, thank you. We have to continue. We have more questions. Andrei, you wanted to pose a question?
Yeah, I'd like to ask, building upon what's just been said about the perhaps a certain lack of Belarusian songs in the midst of protests now, and Per has added a certain historical dimension to this. I've been puzzled personally by the fact that the most prominent song that has emerged from the protests is actually Tsoi's Peremen, either in Russian or sung in Belarusian. Or maybe, this song Mure, which also has a long history from Catalonia to the Polish resistance during the late communist times and so on. And there is, of course, this also a anthem, Magotny Boże, that the protesters sing sometimes. But somehow, I feel, maybe I'm wrong, but there is a vacuum of songs that would unite people the way that they did during the Maidan, for example. And if this is a correct observation, please correct me if I'm wrong, but if it is a correct observation, how does one explain this? What's the reason? Is the reason this fractured Belarusian identity that hasn't matured yet, or what? It is a question to all three panelists.
Yeah, I just start perhaps quickly with regarding the Tsoi's music. It's been around for a long time as well. At least 10 years. It's been used during the 2011 protest movement, which was also been organized through internet, and it was very popular during that time on protests across the country. Magutny Boże, Pagonia, Voyatsky March, all this BNR stuff. Also, rock music, they've been also around for a long time in Belarusian protest culture. I would say my own experience suggests that people kind of knew that music back in 2006 and 10 maybe, but they kind of tend to forget this, maybe because young generation doesn't know much about this music looks like. And I think I would explain this by this decline sort of in knowledge, or this kind of shared cultural knowledge, on the one hand, by the broadness of the movements. Indeed, many people were not exposed to this type of alternative Belarusian culture before, who now came on streets. And at the same time, younger generation, they just as well don't have access to this type of music, but they're learning quickly. And there is another song, Kupalinka, which is folk music, in neutral, much more neutral than other mentioned music. It's been especially popular across more sort of women's-led events, women's-led protest events, which is also interesting and inspiring.
Oh, sorry. Perhaps one should, be careful. We're looking at Ukraine, and we're expecting this to follow certain patterns. So perhaps you read too much into the presence or absence of certain cultural phenomena. I mean, like, since we have a pan-Scandinavian setting here, and with when Swedes get together and we have a party, we sing and we have drinking songs. And when I get together with Norwegians, I assume that Norwegians will be just like us. And it's so striking that Norwegians don't have many drinking songs. Finns have them. We have, and Norwegians don't really have, I might be mistaken here, the same sort of treasure of folk songs the way we do in Sweden with Bellman and Tove and whatnot. Doesn't mean they don't have culture, right? We don't have a Grieg, we don't have a Sibelius, we don't have a Carl Nielsen, we don't have a big classical composer, but we do have that sort of component of our culture, which is absent or weaker in Norway, which is otherwise very culturally competitive, right? So the absence also within Ukraine, in Halichina and Eastern Ukraine, there's divisions also. Many of these songs are regional phenomena and root in certain phenomena. And maybe we are reading too much into it, and we are confirming this idea that, well, they have a vague national consciousness, and therefore they don't have the songs, but in the Halichani and in Galicia, they can sing, and therefore they. So maybe us looking for asking the question the wrong way. I mean, or maybe something is being formed right now. When this movement is over, whatever outcome is going to be, there might be now a canon of songs which now is attributed different importance, perhaps.
I'm wondering, whether in Russia there is a sort of a stock of opposition songs, because I don't really know is there, and perhaps Belarus is similar to Russia in that case, that there isn't. I don't know. This is just. I'm not sure if, now I'm thinking about the young people that I've met in Belarus, and I don't really know if they were singing songs, it was a lot of it was this sort of Soviet or then 1990s rock, sort of Russian rock songs. But I'm also wondering if that's just a thing that maybe nowadays people don't really, I know this sounds horrible, but maybe don't listen to that music. I don't know, contemporary young people in other countries, would they sort of have the similar songs that they would all sort of gather and sing? I think in Finland, the only sort of songs that people know, and that's also not everyone, right? That's only, people know the sort of children's songs that they sing when they're little, and then they know these sort of academic environment drinking songs.
Well, the songs played a huge role, of course, in the protest movement at the end of the Soviet Union in the Baltic countries, in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. So it's a legitimate question, of course, of national traditions and whether Belarus is going to be aligned more with that tradition now, that is, its identity is being shaped further. Or the Russians whose protest songs, it's the same toy, isn't it? And basically very little else, if I'm not mistaken.
We have time for at least one more question.
My name is Ingvar Stenholt. I'm a founding member of the research group and associate professor at UiT, the Arctic University of Norway. Closest colleague with André. We were talking a little bit about the Scandinavian, the Scandinavian qualities of this discussion, or Nordic qualities of this discussion, and of course we sense in our media, at least, that there's this romanticism, political romanticism, that always comes with protest movements, and you sort of assume that things are now going to be better in Belarus if Lukashenka, or when Lukashenka steps down. But experience shows us that it's not quite that easy. So I would like to ask all the panelists, what qualities do this opposition movement have that gives them a chance in the event of Lukashenko's demise in creating something not necessarily akin to democracy in the Western sense, but a more democratic and more egalitarian or politically open Belarus?
I would say three. It's a great question, and I've been puzzled by it since Lund, since May, when we saw emerging. That hasn't been emerging. And the first question I've been asking myself: what do those people want who are now joining Babarika teams, Tikhanovskaya teams, candidates team during election, and later on, who went on streets? And as I mentioned, there is an ongoing online poll. People who participate in protests ask, what is the reason why you participate? And most people say that one of the key reasons is they want free and fair election. And for me, it's a sign that people really are thinking about democracy, at least in maybe simplistic ways, but this is broadly pro-democratic movement, which gives some hope. So first, there is a hope because many people wanted democratic election. Second hope is this phenomena we've been discussing, emergence of something that reminds, some people call it civil society, some people call it some kind of stronger national identity feeling. And this feeling, I think, comes in European tradition. It is akin to what exists and to the feeling exists in Baltic states, I believe. So I believe within this tradition of the region, Belarus is emerging as actually what people say. We want normal European country, or been saying before when they participate in protest movements. So I think now this kind of more typical, not unusual Soviet rudiment, but more sort of boring type of state emerging in Belarus, hopefully. And the third reason to be optimistic about that movement is its current coordinating political public structures that are very inclusive, that unite all different types of political figures, both from who've been just part of the regime very recently, and those people who come in from workers' movement, from trade unions, people come from intellectual elites, and so on and so forth. And it's a broad sort of combination of people, which is also demonstrates that people are able to talk to each other, people who've been recognized as symbolic leaders, been able to sort of speak to wider population, and they've been listened, and their message is positive. It's very inclusive message, I would say. Maybe sometimes it's populist message, but nevertheless, there is no aggressiveness in it, which is also gives some hope. So those three things give personally hope to me.
Thank you. I think we have to end on that positive note. We are unfortunately out of time, but it has been a fruitful discussion, and it will be really interesting to keep following the situation as it develops. I'll ask all of you to follow our research group on Facebook, where we will continue to publish relevant material on not only about Belarus, but also about the region in general. So on behalf of the RSCPR, I would like to thank our panel, Ales, Kristiina, and Per, for sharing their expert opinions. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure, to participate, and actually it would be nice to have some kind of follow-up so that you'll get more of your expertise on the protest and also this music and culture aspect. I think that would be great.
I'm sure there will be several follow-ups in the time to come. Okay, so thank you, and to the audience for participating, and I'll see you.